Hello, everyone. This is the third episode of the podcast uh, and on climate finance and what do development banks have to do with it. I'm the moderator of this conversation, and we're going to have two incredible guests here, well-established experts from Brazil and from the United States, Clemence Landers and Claudia Prates. The name of the episode is Climate Finance. What do development banks have to do with it? I just mentioned that. The podcast name is Development Banks in Green Transition, which is a product of a project that I've been leading on enhancing resources mobilization for sustainable investment through multilateral development banks, partnering with the national development banks. And this is a work that has been sponsored, but it's with CEBRI, of course, was being sponsored by the Center for Global Development. And we have 6 episodes related to this project. And the project looks at, there is a whole discussion, as we know, about the reforms of multilateral development banks. The project takes a slightly different view from the issues because we're looking at how these reforms can enhance the partnership with national development banks that we see would be very beneficial in terms of mobilizing domestic resources, private sector resources for the transition. So I am, as I said, my name is Rogério Studart. I'm the moderator here. I'm a senior fellow at CEBRI, at the Center of Political Economy. I'm a macroeconomist specializing in international finance, and it will become clear pretty soon with a passion for transition to a low carbon and more resilient and just economy. Clemence Landers, and I want to thank you ahead in participating as a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. And prior to joining the Center for Global Development, she worked at the U.S. Treasury with their engagement with Multilateral Development Bank as a desk economist covering several countries in the Middle East and North Africa region. Later, she served as an advisor to the U.S. Executive Director at the World Bank, where she worked in the replenishment of a very important part of the bank, which is the International Development Association, and represented the U.S. government on several board committees. After leaving the bank, she joined the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, where she led the organization expansion into the Francophone West Africa. Before joining the U.S. government, Landers had a Scott Family Liberia Fellowship and served as an advisor to the Liberian Finance Minister under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. In this capacity, she worked on the Liberia's landmark debt relief agreement. I also saw that happening, and a range of economic policy issues. And she has a degree in science, Paul and Cornell University. The other one, and also an extremely established and well-known expert, is Claudia Prates. She's an economist, and she holds an MA in economics from my own alma mater, the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, has an MBA with COPE-AD, which is a very well-known MBA program in Brazil. She is an executive with a career that spans for 28 years in the Brazilian National Development Bank, BNDES, and she held several positions, including Deputy Managing Director from 2008 to 2010, Credit Risk and Recovery Deputy Managing Director, 2010-2016. She was the Managing Director from 2016 to 2019, overlooking industry and service areas, business origination and export. She also presided the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, as a Director General for the Americas from August 19 and 2023, when she returned to BNDES as head of the Climate Department, overlooking strategy and actions for the bank's climate transition. So this is how accomplished these young ladies are. I'm pleased to be moderating this conversation. If I can find the questions now, I want to start right away. So the first question that I want you to talk about is this. We all know that in order to transition to a more sustainable, environmentally and social sustainable future, we have to make investments in the order of trillions of dollars. And we are still very far from that. And we know that there has been an increase in climate finance up to $1 trillion now, but we have many more, at least $8 trillion needed in order to cover every year to cover the gap. How do you think that multilateral development banks in general can help fulfill this gap? So if I may start, I give the floor to Clemence. Please go ahead, Clemence. You have the floor.
Well, thank you, Rogério. And I think we're kicking off maybe with one of the most difficult questions right now in development and climate finance is how to close this very significant gap that you mentioned. And in particular, over the last several years, the multilateral development banks have really gotten a lot of attention from the climate finance community as a potentially very important source of climate finance. Today, for instance, the World Bank is actually doing about 40% of the finance the World Bank is doing is climate finance. And that's pretty much evenly split between mitigation and adaptation. IBRD tends to be a little bit more mitigation focused since it works more with upper middle income countries, which are bigger emitters. Whereas IDA, which is the part of the World Bank that works with lower income countries, tends to be a little bit more adaptation focused, because that's really where climate finance demand is residing with a lot of the lower income countries. But even when you look at the full multilateral development bank system, you're really just very, very far off from the trillions of dollars that you mentioned. You're probably somewhere in the 40 to 60 billion dollar range. So you're really not hitting that goal. And so there's been a lot of conversations right now, and especially really focused at the World Bank. It's called amongst the specialists this agenda that's called the evolution agenda. And part of the impetus around this agenda was really seeing the World Bank as playing a much bigger role in climate, but also on global challenges and a lot of these issues that require a lot more international coordination than just the kind of standard project by project, country by country type operations that the World Bank was doing. And I think in particular, the COVID crisis, which was kind of one of those kind of global crises, which made, where that required a lot of coordination across countries and a lot of cooperation, really showed that the bank was actually not entirely well equipped to be dealing with that. And so if the bank kind of missed the mark a little bit on COVID, that made a lot of people very nervous that the bank was also going to miss the mark on the climate. And so in particular, a lot of the questions at the bank right now and a lot of the debate within the multilateral development banking system right now is the kind of core DNA of the World Bank is really this idea that projects and programs are demand driven. It's the client, it's the government that's in the driver's seat, and this is on the public sector side, and I'll come to the private sector side in a second. So it's really the clients that build, out what they want their portfolios to look like. So in some countries, the World Bank projects can be very climate focused, and in other countries, there may be a little bit less of a climate focus. So the question really is, what can you do? What can the bank do to incentivize countries to borrow a little bit more for climate, or a little bit more for other global challenges? And one of the core parts of this reform agenda at the World Bank has really been looking into, can you do price incentives? So can you make certain types of projects a little bit cheaper to incentivize countries to do more of them? And can you do volume incentives? So if you borrow for a specific global public good type project, can you get a little bit more cash than you would have been getting otherwise for a different kind of project? And we can kind of get into a little bit later some of the controversy and some of the political economy of these reforms, because it's not always easy. But this is kind of the state of play today at the World Bank of really how do you build up this portfolio more? And then there's obviously in the background of this a lot of debate about how do you just grow the size of the institution much more, so you have a bigger bank and a bigger pot of money to deploy for climate. The second thing that I'll just say, and I'll say this, very quickly, is that part of, I think, where you're alluding to in your question is this whole billions to trillions debate, which has been, I think, kind of going on for the past decade, of how can you use development finance more strategically to leverage private capital. And I tend to think of this a little bit as the white whale of development finance. And part of the idea of this is, maybe you could use, a small amount of public money to leverage multiples in private finance. And, when you look at the numbers, the reality is that this really hasn't materialized. Today, when you look at kind of the private sector, what the IFC and different parts of the MDB system that focus on private sector, they're actually mobilizing on a 1 to 0.7 basis. So that's really far from the 1 to 10, 1 to 100 numbers that are out there in kind of the aspirational numbers around the billions to trillions agenda. And I think that, there are a whole host of reasons for which I think, this mobilization piece, which is so critical to actually getting to those big numbers that you were talking about, Rogério. But this is really one of the places, I think, where the MDB system has really, really not succeeded.
Thank you, Clemence. So basically, the issue of project development and leveraging, you mentioned, it became very clear in my mind. Claudia has a different experience looking from within a very large national development bank. What do you say, Claudia?
I say that I agree. First of all, good afternoon, good morning. Thank you for the invitation, Rogério, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, Clemence. And I hope that I can contribute in the discussion with my perspective of national bank and also with my experience in multilaterals, as I worked for about almost 4 years in the NDB at the beginning in Brazil. So to establish the NDB. And before I start talking about the mobilization of resources, I would like to highlight the COVID process. At that time in Brazil, I was in the NDB, and there was a challenge to mobilize resources from World Bank, IDB, CAF, the NDB, and all multilaterals. We joined together, and each of us, including World Bank focused more on the assistance, and each bank we joined together and we discussed, and it was a mobilization about $5 billion from all banks, that in my opinion should be one path that we could go for climate. Let's say join forces, and also have in Brazil, especially I'm talking about Brazil, have an approval and a guidance from the government that all the money should go to the climate finance, and especially for adaptation, that it's a kind of money that for the trillions, and that they talk about 5% only go to adaptation, and especially the South countries suffer a lot with the climate change consequences, as we've been seeing in Brazil. Because in my history here, we don't have earthquakes, we don't have like accidents, but now with climate, Brazil is on the center of that. So we have lots of consequences of that, and the consequences are direct and indirect, because for a while we have the economical consequences of a climate crisis, as we have now in Rio Grande do Sul, we had in Petrópolis, we had in Santa Catarina, lots of states in Brazil, and the money that flows for adaptation is very small. And for mitigation, I think that the multilaterals and national banks can contribute together, because we have long-term financing that's very important for this kind of finance, because it's a new, let's say new, I don't like to say new business, but it's a new kind of projects that that sometimes have technological challenges, or the term of return of the projects are very long. It's not attractive for private sector, so we have to have concessional money, blended finance. We have to combine the flow of money that we have in the world, like GCF and other funds that have plenty of money, but they go in each project, analyze project by project. For that, the impact, it's not going to be enough. We have to mobilize resources and go like, we have a project, we have a platform of projects that we need the flow of money for that. And for instance, BNDES and World Bank signed in the last COP an agreement about $1 billion focus on hydrogen and decarbonization, and it's broad. So it's not, oh, I'm going to finance this project. I'm going to finance a bunch of projects that can go, the flow of money is going to hydrogen, it's going to decarbonization and mitigation in general. And this kind of projects, like we have like not one project and 2-3 projects, but the flow of money going to catalytic, like a catalytic funding. You have the projects, you de-risk because BNDES is taking part, or other national banks and multilaterals that have a due diligence very, very that go deeply in the project, and the experience in other countries that can mitigate some risks and at the end attract capital, private money for that as well. So we can multiply, let's say, de-risking at the beginning and then attracting private sector to finance. And as I said, concessional finance is very important. And you see BNDES is big, but we have only the climate fund now to finance decarbonization, and the partnership that we have with the NDB, with IDB, with World Bank, that we have flow of money going to, we have contracts signed to go to decarbonization, new technologies for mitigation. And in my opinion, now we have to focus on also in adaptation, because the cost of not doing it, it's largely, it's much more costly than do the investment now, including infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, that we start digging in and trying to turn the projects more resilient, especially in some regions in Brazil. And also I'd like to mention the policy development, because multilaterals and national banks can contribute with their knowledge about projects to the policy development of the governance in general. As we have experience, as we are neutral, as we know what are the bottlenecks to spread up this kind, to scale up this kind of investment, especially in nature-based solution projects that we are starting a new business in the world. It's very needed business, especially in Brazil. So maybe summing up, I think that catalyst funding, long-term financing, concessional finance, and technical assistance that this kind of banks can provide and can help have a pipeline of good projects to be bankable and attract private money for that, capital, private sector money.
This is it could not be more complementary to what you're saying. Clemence, you mentioned the issue of projects. You said it has to be climate driven. The fact is, what Claudia is saying is that there is a problem with creation of pipelines, and the multilateral banks could help that. The creation of pipelines has to do with both creating attractive cost of capital, by blending finance and so on, but also working on creating this pipeline themselves, right? And so this is very complementary. Let me ask you, having said all that, what do you think are the main barriers for these institutions fulfilling this role, and the barriers in terms of them cooperating in order to do more blended finance, helping creating the pipelines, bringing the flows of private capital, crowding private capital into the game? What do you think are the main obstacles nowadays for them doing that? If I may ask you, Clemence, to take the floor and go from there.
Sorry, just looking for that mute button. This is a great question. It's a hard question to answer, and I think I might answer this in two different ways. I think there are some problems that are technical. There are some problems that I think are conceptual. And then I think there are some problems that are actually political. So let me start with the technical ones, because I think those are easier to solve. When I look at the MDBs and when you read actually the charter, even of the IBRD and how the institution was set up, loans were not meant to be the dominant instrument that the World Bank was using. It was actually supposed to be guarantees. And this is the reason for which I mention this, and the reason for which I think this is important is, you touched upon, Claudia, issues around cost of capital, which I agree. I mean, I think these are some of the most central issues. And and guarantees are actually, we did a study at the Center for Global Development where we looked at some of the guarantee instruments at the bank and found that on average they lowered the cost of capital for countries by 330 basis points, which is enormous. And so it's interesting because even though guarantees are kind of part and parcel of what these institutions and what the multilateral development banks and the World Bank are really supposed to be doing, kind of at the foundational ideas around the creation of these institutions, they've just done very few. The portfolio, the book, when you look at the World Bank's exposure, it's mostly, really vast majority, predominantly in loans. And you can ask yourself a lot of questions as to why the guarantee instruments haven't taken off. And as a matter of fact, I think the World Bank and Ajay Banga, who's the new president of the World Bank, has been very focused on this and trying to create a guarantee platform and a one-stop shop kind of for the World Bank guarantees. I think the World Bank has over 30 different kinds of guarantees, each residing in a different part of the institution. But I think this is to your point, Rogério, about country demand. I think a lot of countries are really asking for this type of instrument that can help lower cost of capital. And so there's a lot of thinking, I think, that's happening right now about how do you incentivize the use of these instruments on the bank side, and what's kind of prevented the bank from kind of meeting country demand on the use, in particular, of guarantees. And just that earlier I'd given that mobilization figure that kind of the average level of mobilization is $1 mobilizes 0.8 cents in private capital. When you look at guarantees, $1 of guarantee mobilizes about $1.8 in private capital. So those mobilization numbers are just a lot better. So not only does it lower cost of capital, but it mobilizes a lot. They mobilize a lot more private capital. Then I would also just say, kind of taking a step back, pricing. I think pricing is becoming increasingly a big problem. And we're now in a high interest rate environment. And I think this is making the multilateral development banks, frankly, a lot less attractive a partner for a lot of emerging markets. So, when global interest rates were low, you could pay as low as 1 or 1.5% to borrow from IBRD. Today, countries are paying between 5 and 6% to borrow from IBRD. And that's just a huge increase. And we're now talking about loans that are quite costly. And a lot of countries pay 6-7% to borrow from the market. And so the trade-off then becomes, why would I go to IBRD when it's often slow, takes time, when I can go to the market, maybe pay a premium of 100 basis points, but I can get money with much less strings attached and much faster. And this is, I think, kind of a core existential issue right now for the institution, especially in a high interest rate environment. And it kind of links to this point that I also just wanted to make about, one of the things you hear a lot from countries that borrow from IBRD or different multilateral development banks is that they can be very hard to work with. It can take a long time to get a loan from kind of project, from the request to getting it to the board, to getting to the first disbursement. And countries don't, a lot of governments operate in real time, and the World Bank is just incredibly slow. And I think this is also something where there's kind of a real reckoning in the MDB system, and partially prompted by the fact that a lot of borrowers have now a lot of alternative places they can go and borrow. So the World Bank is not the only provider in town anymore. There's just a lot of other providers, and so the World Bank is worried about its own competitiveness. And then I think the final point that I'll make, and this is more linked to the political, is and Claudia was talking a lot about concessional finance, and especially concessional finance, both for de-risking, but also for things like adaptation and projects that really need public public money and not private financing, concessionality and concessional finance comes from one place, and it comes from donors. The market doesn't generate concessionality. And when you look at a lot of the big traditional donors today, be it the United States, be it in Europe, be it in parts of Asia, a lot of these donors are becoming just simply less and less generous. And the extent that they are, focused on providing foreign, kind of foreign assistance, it's really for, we're seeing a lot of money went to Ukraine. A lot of money is going towards, in Europe, towards hosting refugees. But foreign assistance kind of for things like, concessionality, for adaptation and programs that are more development focused in their nature is just, the money just isn't there in the same levels that it used to be. And the outlook is not particularly good in kind of an era where, we're less kind of focused on international solidarity and much more focused on domestic interests. And I think that's just a long-term challenge that that's very political in nature. But I think it's one of the defining ones of our time when you think about a lot of these issues.
Thank you, Clemence. I want to come back to you on the question of philanthropy, but before that, I would like to ask Claudia, what say you?
I would like to compliment Clemence, and then I'll answer. I think that not only multilaterals, but also BNDES now, it's much more expensive than it used to be. And also we have lots of requirements, especially now for climate and for a while for social and also for environmental. So all these requirements now, they are very costly for the lender. Say, okay, I'm going to go to BNDES and they're going to ask me social, environmental, and now climate risk. And why I go to BNDES? Because the cost of the fund is as the market is. I think that not only BNDES, but also multilaterals can sometimes, because they can go longer, it's still attractive, but less than it was. So this is a very important issue that you raised. And in this moment, how you can scale up mitigation investments and also adaptation with this cost of fund and all the requirements that those banks comes with. So it's very, very it's very tricky and very difficult. For me, this is a bottleneck. It's an obstacle. And to overcome it, I think that guarantees maybe could be a path to go through, because with a guarantee from the World Bank that's AAA instead of the double B of Brazil. So it's good to have it and good to have this stamp, but depends on the cost. And especially because if we go to the international market, we have the problem of the hard currency. So, and to bring the money to Brazil and to make loans to this kind of projects, you need to be in reais in Brazil or in the other currency in South Africa or in rand in South Africa, depends on the country. And so you have to transform it and have the swap cost. That's not a cost that can be bear sometimes for the project, depending on the project, especially for this project that we want to scale up for climate and risk, etc., mitigation and adaptation. So it's very important to sit down, and this reform can be a good path to go and to discuss how can we work better with all the requirements that we have to induce more investments to in climate with a cost that is bearable to our clients. Now BNDES has two funds, that Amazon fund that comes from donation, and we do lots of blended with that, and also climate fund. But the climate fund is not because Brazil issue a bond, green bond, and now the resources in the climate fund, now it's $2 billion. It used to be like $100 billion, something like that. So small. Now it's bigger, but it's not enough at all. And we have lots of investments to scale up here in Brazil and we need, because the carbon check for Brazil, the carbon check for the US, all carbon checks are gone. We have to accelerate. We have to have mechanisms to accelerate the climate mitigation in the world. So without that, we're going to discuss lots of infrastructure projects in the World Bank, in BNDES, in IDB, and the project could have lots of problems in the future because of the climate consequences that we are going to bear, and we are facing now. And so I think that this reform can have some results, but we should pursue all the time to reduce our cost of money, to induce those kind of projects that are very important for climate. And so for me, the more important obstacles are the cost of money, the project pipeline that I mentioned, sure. And so for that, I think we have a very, very important role to play, and hard currency. So I think that these obstacles, we have to focus on that and then try to mitigate and scale up investments for climate as soon as possible.
Let me ask you something. You the two of you have brought issues that makes me feel like kind of leaving a little bit the script and asking you a question. Okay, clearly we're merging into common issues here. Project development, for instance, how you deal with currency risk, how we increase blended finance in order to reduce the cost of capital. But in the past few years or so, I've been dealing a lot with philanthropies, and they have become quite significant. But one thing that I notice is that first, they are very fragmented in the way they allocate the resources. They have very high transaction costs. They don't know how to do basic things, for instance, how to develop projects, how to deal with currency risk and things like that. My feeling is that sometimes development national and multilateral development banks are not seducing enough those big philanthropies in order to fill those gaps. They're not working enough with these philanthropies. We basically, when you talk about donors, Clemence, but also when you talk about funds, Claudia, you're talking about sovereign donors. And this is drying. But perhaps there are other sources of funding, like philanthropies, impact investors that the banks are not tapping. Do you have that sense? And if so, how can multilateral development banks work together in order to attract these new potential sources of funding? Let me turn to Claudia first this time, and then Clemence, so that to change a little bit the dynamics here.
I'm touching base with this world, but I know that I know that GCF and other funds has lots of money to that can be used for climate finance. But BNDES is accrediting GCF, and there's no money here in BNDES from GCF. It's very difficult. And when we talk to them, they say, no, we need some projects, but we have already applied for some projects. But project by project, as I said, as I mentioned before, is not the way that I think that things are going to be scaled up. You have to, you have like a portfolio of projects that you can build. For that, we have $1 billion. So we can attract capital, we can attract private capital as well, and our capital, and then let's say triplicate that and look for projects for climate and say, okay, we have a blended finance here that we can finance you with low cost because we have $1 billion coming from GCF or other funds. There are, I think, 4 or 5 funds that have money for that, So I think that's important that we could know better. I know that IDB and World Bank, they have already used GCF. Maybe we do a partnership with multilaterals to have this kind of money in BNDES, in other South Africa Development Bank, and the banks, and that we can spread, not only Brazil, of course, but spread this money, but in a way that we work with portfolios, not small projects. We need impact. We don't need small impact. We need impact. And then we can, let's say, turn $1 in $3 with our money, our own money, or maybe with World Bank as BNDES and GCF, and then putting them together to have impact and lower the cost, because the cost now is high, not only for the World Bank, but for BNDES is the same.
Thank you. Yeah, you mentioned GCF. I just worked recently on the report on the vertical climate funds for the G20 Brazilian presidency, and I can confirm that that's an issue in not only in Brazil but other clients or other partners of GCF. But looking at the broader pictures in terms of philanthropies, I see a significant amount of money. Because of increasing wealth inequality, you see a significant amount of money coming from private philanthropies and private impact investors that are not being tapped by these banks.
I agree with you, and we were working with GFANS now, trying to build platform of projects. We are just beginning. It's not already ready, and trying to achieve this kind of money, philanthropies, and also private sector that has interest in projects in nature-based solution as well. So maybe with that, organizing the investments needed in Brazil for each sector, maybe we can touch these philanthropies, and with the help of Bloomberg Philanthropies and GFANS, let's see. And I hope that can be a path that we can go in Brazil, and then try to touch these funds that come from philanthropies and other kind of money that can scale up our projects in Brazil.
Thank you, Claudia. What say you, Clemence?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with this. I mean, I think one of the overarching point that you're both making that I really fully agree with is you're looking at an extremely fragmented climate architecture, where there are just an enormous amount of little funds that exist, but that the whole system is operating in a way is less than its sum of its parts, right? So, Claudia, you were referring to the Green Climate Fund. There are also the climate investment funds. The international community just created this new loss and damage fund. There's the Global Environmental Facility. There's just a whole network of smallish funds that are very hard to navigate. And we did a little study where we looked at all of these different funds, and we actually found that one of the things that really gets lost when you have such a fragmented approach is the funds aren't allocating resources strategically. So the biggest emitters aren't getting most of the mitigation financing, the most vulnerable countries aren't getting most of the adaptation financing, and it just is a very a system that's just, as I said, I think is really operating as less than the sum of its parts. Now, Rogério, this question of kind of philanthropic financing and capital is really interesting. And I think this has kind of been something that a lot of the funds, including a lot of the multilateral development banks, have been thinking of. How do we get more philanthropic capital on our balance sheets? And the African Development Fund, actually, as a matter of fact, is in part of their last replenishment, created something called a climate action window, where the expectation was there would be some governments putting money into that, but there would also be philanthropies putting money into that. And last I checked, they had yet to get any major philanthropic resources. And so this is a problem. And I think part of it is linked to the fact that once a philanthropy donates to a multilateral institution, they often want a seat on the board and to be able to participate in the governance decisions. And then governments tend to feel uncomfortable kind of sharing their oversight of these institutions with, philanthropies, which are not, democratically kind of elected sovereigns, the way governments are. So there's a political economy problem there. I do think one of the areas where I think philanthropic capital we're seeing it coming in an interesting way is in a lot of these debt for nature swaps. And so for a lot of countries are basically reprofiling some of their debt using philanthropic capital to retire expensive debt and take out newer debt at slightly cheaper terms, and then using some of those savings to do things like conservation investments. We recently saw actually Ecuador do a debt for nature swap with, or they're calling it a debt for conservation swap with the IDB and the USDFC.
Yes.
You know, I think one of the questions are these scalable, and are these, you know, the most kind of efficient use of philanthropic capital? And I think that's still kind of a big question. But right now, again, you know, I think the real struggle when you think about the MDBs is how to bring that onto the balance sheet, and that I think that remains a very much an unanswered question.
Clemence said something that it's extremely, both of you have said a very interesting thing, but when you say that the operation with Ecuador, it's an amazing example, because what they did was basically to say, okay, we're going to swap the debt with some allocation in the future to Galapagos, to preserving the Galapagos. And of course, the Ecuador itself is extremely interested in preserving that. That's a natural resources that they were not the resources. I'm forgetting the expression here, wealth or whatever that they hold, but it's also shared by humanity. And this is something that has not been explored enough. I think that a lot of philanthropists, I've been talking to a lot of philanthropies, I'm talking about private philanthropies, individual philanthropies that say, you know, for instance, if we had a debt swap large enough in the Amazon region and in other, you know, basic biomas, and we felt comfortable in having, you know, the development banks being the ones managing this relationship, I think we go for it. We don't have the, you know, they know the transaction cost is too high. I'm just throwing that to you because I find that example so interesting that should be more studied. Perhaps you want to make a further comment on this, and perhaps to say, well, how can national and multilateral development banks, for instance, could work more together in order to think out of the box in terms of mobilization of resources? We don't have much time, but please, if you could, each of you, you know, speak about that, if you feel like it, in 2 or 3 minutes, that would be great. Now let's start with Claudia, if that's okay. But you can talk about anything else. I'm just curious.
No, but it's a good, because normally when we discuss with World Bank, IDB, we discuss about the new loan, how we can apply the loan for our transactions. Now we could work together. I think it's a good challenging that we can, because we need the same. We need to put this kind of money in our balance sheet and then do a blended and scale up some projects. So it's a good challenge that I think that if we join forces, I was not thinking about that, but it could be a good result of this podcast. I think that we should try to mobilize our team here that works with the NDBs and try to not only work with guarantees, that Clemence mentioned, I think it's a good path to go as well, but also to mobilize this kind of funds, philanthropic monies, to show them that we de-risk projects, that we can share risk with private sector, that we can go with long tenors and have a good impact in the economy, especially for climate finance, sustainable finance. And so in that way, this kind of joining forces could have a good result if we achieve and bring this kind of money for climate finance with less cost, less transactional cost.
Claudia, you don't know how much you're helping me with my project, because what you're saying is that perhaps instead of just thinking about project by project, loan by loan, and blending finance, the MDBs and the National Development Bank should think more strategically together on how to join forces in mobilizing resources both nationally and internationally. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. Exactly.
Okay.
But your question drove to that, so it's your provocation.
No. To be very frank with you, I had no intention of doing that, and I think that but I don't regret having raised the issue, because the conclusion can be extremely interesting. Clemence, what say you about that?
Yeah, no, I actually don't. I think Claudia said it perfectly, so I don't really have much to add on that point. I'm in full agreement, and as a matter of fact, the little that I've seen and understood of the Brazilian ecological transformation plan is that what it's called. Really seems to be taking this approach. I mean, giving obviously the driving role to BNDES to kind of organize those investment plans, and I think that's incredibly important, actually, that it be the National Development Bank that's setting the agenda and setting that strategy and the financing, and then sort of IDB and World Bank and other multilaterals come in, backing that and coming in kind of as a partner. To the National Development Bank. So I thought that was I think Brazil really just put forward a new model, which will hopefully other countries hopefully will be a successful model that other countries can emulate.
Well, again, this is so helpful. Thank you. Because what are you saying? It's, if you look at the the examples of collaboration, for instance, between multilaterals and the Brazilian government, particularly BNDES, when it comes to these issues, the ones that are successful are the ones that solve very practical problems. For instance, the Eco Invest project with the IDB, basically they are looking at what are the obstacles of attracting international money and making them into national currency resource mobilization. So I think perhaps this is the future. It doesn't require, and going back to your political issues, Clemence, it can kind of not overcome the political issues, but it's management to management saying, hey, we got a problem here that we can solve together. Let's try to put this together. Is that what you choose leaning towards?
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that is the future. And I think it requires, at the center of it, it requires a government that's organized and that has a vision that then investors can then rally behind, right? I mean, that's the center. And I think, Brazil's in a very enviable position that it has that. Not all countries have that. Different, there are still, the reality is there are still a lot of countries that aren't there. But I really look forward to seeing what comes out of this plan for Brazil. I'm very optimistic.
Okay, well, I'd like to continue this because I agree with you, but you have to start somewhere. And I think that if perhaps the BNDES and the multilaterals can show a way to go, perhaps we have more hope. But I have to close. I think I have to close very quickly. And I have to do the official closing, but then I want you to spend a little bit of time because I want to thank you. So this podcast is a product of the project Enhancing Resource Mobilization for Sustainable Investment through Multilateral Banks, partnering with national development banks. It's a partnership between the Brazilian Center of International Relations and the Center for Global Development. It has 6 episodes, and this is the 3rd one. I had the pleasure to talk to Claudia Prates and Clemence Landers. You can see, how great it. There's so much information that the listener she'll have to, see a couple times to get the some of the leads that you have to take in order to have a discussion about the issue. So I want to thank you two very, very much, Claudia and Clemence. This podcast is going to come out soon. But I also want to thank the people working on that from the side of CEBRI and also those recording it, Gustavo Bezerra, Isabela Rodrigues, Alice Nascimento, and Rodrigo. And well, what can I say? You helped me a lot to think about issues that I had not thought about before. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Rogério. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Rogério. Thank you to CEBRI. This was fantastic.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.